So without further delay, please enjoy my second round conversation with Lane. Good to see you again, man.
Yeah, I'm happy to be back. I'm stoked for this. We had a marathon session the first time. I think we got through like a third of the topics that you were interested in. So we'll see how we do this time.
Yeah. Well, and of course, a lot of people had a bunch of follow-up questions. So some combination of all the things we didn't get to talk about, plus some new things I thought about, and you and I have had a bunch of change over the last few months, coupled with some of that residual stuff. But one of the topics that people really want to hear you and I talk about, I think there's this belief that we are going to be so orthogonal in our views, and we will have not a single thing in common. Well, I'm pretty sure this isn't going to be the case. Is on energy balance and the role of calories in weight gain. So why don't we just lead with the fireworks that everyone is hoping for? So talk to me about energy balance, calories, and weight gain.
So I think one of the big misunderstandings is people don't really understand what energy balance truly is. If we look at what most people think it is, well, I track my calories in the therefore, if I am burning 2,500 calories a day and tracking 2,000 calories a day, I should lose 1 pound of body weight per week linearly, and that's just how it should go. Perfect now. And when that doesn't happen, they go, look, you just said. And there's a lot of different reasons for that. But before we get into that, let's talk about what energy balance is. So it is calories in versus calories out, or the energy you consume versus the energy you spend. And if we're talking about, real quick before we get into that, what do we mean by energy? A lot of what people say, well, calories, they don't even exist. You can't look at them under a microscope. No, you can't look at them under a microscope. What we're talking about is the energy stored in the chemical bonds of food. And when you break that food down, those molecules go through metabolism, go through glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, that energy is liberated, but captured ultimately as mostly ATP, which is our high energy phosphate.
Halfway there.
You can't just store a bunch of ATP. It's not practical for the body, and ATP is a very unstable molecule. So we evolved to have fat stores or adipose tissue, basically to store excess energy. Now you can store some in glycogen. I would argue that you really can't store some in protein. Some people will say, well, you can break down lean tissue. To me, that's kind of like saying, let's build a house so it's a reservoir for wood. I don't really think that that's a...
It's a great analogy. I built this amazing teak table such that if I need firewood, I've got it right there.
Right. In practicality, are you right? Sure, yeah, you could, but that's not why you built the table.
Yeah, that's the nuclear option. Yeah.
Right, for sure. And if you look at the contribution of glycogen to your relative energy store, it's actually really small.
10 seconds.
You're talking about 1,500 to 2,000 calories. So your adipose is by far the biggest store. And you store it that way because one, it's economically too fast because you can fit a large amount of lipid in a small area. And it's energy dense. And it's relatively easy to convert to.
And it's anhydrous, so therefore it's incredibly well packed, as you said. Glycogen has to track with all that water. It's not a very efficient store.
Correct. You would be 800 pounds if you were trying to store the same amount of energy. Like, there's a lot of really practical reasons why the body evolved that way. Now, when we say calories, calories are literally a measurement of energy. So this is really important to understand. When people say, well, are all calories created equal? That's like saying, are different notches on your speedometer different? No, this is just a unit of measurement. Literally all that is. And you truly have to think of it as energy. So if we think of it as the energy stored in the chemical bond that
10
is
seconds.
transferred throughout these various metabolic processes, and that's what metabolism really is trying to capture that energy. When we look at what the energy inside of that is essentially the metabolizable energy in food. There's a couple of important caveats. Notice I said metabolizable energy, because not everything in food is metabolizable, especially with regards to fiber, and specifically insoluble fiber. It used to be thought that insoluble fibers can't digest it at all. It's absolutely 0 calories, and I wouldn't say that there's good evidence, but there's starting to be some evidence to suggest that our gut microbiome can actually extract some calories from the insoluble fiber you eat. That's coming from a friend of mine, Suzanne Nepcoda, who's one of the premier gut microbiome experts in the world. She actually did her master's in the same lab I was in. Very smart person, has been to like the Nobel ceremony, incredibly well respected. So there is some evidence of that. And then when you come to soluble fiber, it's pretty variable. It's like anywhere from 1 to 4 calories per gram, so anywhere from a normal carbohydrate amount to 1 calorie. And it also probably depends on your individual gut microbiome. Even before we get to the calories outside of things, we see that there is some variability and probably some individual variability in how many calories one person can consume and then actually have available as energy.
Lane, I like that you started with this. I'm just going to add a couple of points so that we can build off this together. So let's even give people the definition of a calorie. And I think we should remind people that when you and I and most people are talking about calories, we're really talking about kilocalories. And some people will get those confused. So big C calorie is equal to 1,000 little c calories or a K calorie. But regardless of that nomenclature, I think most people, when they're saying I eat 2,000 calories, are of course referring to kilocalories. One of those, if I'm not mistaken, and you're really probably remembering this better than me, rest. 1 calorie, I believe, is the energy required to heat 1 gram of water from 14.5 to 15.5 degrees Celsius at 1 atmosphere, correct?
Bingo. About right. I actually have specifically forgotten the exact definition. It's basically the amount to increase the degree of water by 1 degree Celsius.
So again, to your point, it's simply a unit of energy, just as we would think of a joule as a unit of energy. I also want to highlight something you said, which I think is a very important thing for people to understand, which is when we talk about the conservation of energy, that also implies when you change forms of energy. So when you eat food, the energy, as you said, is stored within the bonds. It is chemical energy. We turn that into electrical energy.
10 seconds.
The electron transport chain. And then we turn it right back into chemical energy, both in the immediate sense of ATP, where you, again, now create the energy in the cell.
Last
More
round.
importantly, as you said, when you're storing it, you're putting it right back into a hydrocarbon. And it's those carbon-carbon-carbon-hydrogen bonds that, if my memory serves me correctly, are the most energy-dense bonds within our body, much more than, say, a carbon-oxygen bond.
And that's why you see fatty acids have much more calories and much more energy per gram compared to carbohydrate, because carbohydrate has more oxygens, whereas fats, through beta oxidation, where you're popping off 2 carbon hydrogens, you can pretty much, I mean, it's not direct, you can pretty much create acetyl-CoA right from that, which then goes into directly into the Krebs cycle. Whereas glucose, there's a lot more involved in generating ATP from that. Now, glucose does have benefits in terms of amount of oxygen required to generate the same ATP. It just depends on the metric.
The final point you make there, Lane, I think is worth restating because it is so important, which is, and this will come up later, I think, when we talk about genetic differences in tolerance to amounts of macronutrients like that, but you can really liberate different amounts of energy from the same foods, depending on many things, but presumably based on your gut microbiome. That's probably one of the things that's going to create a pretty sizable delta when it comes to how much food you're capturing. In other words, how much of that chemical energy you're able to recoup and repurpose into electrical energy.
There is evidence, for example, that obesity-prone people, they have a gut microflora that is better able to extract energy from the food they eat. Now, that could be reverse causation as well. It could be that obese people eat a diet that causes this kind of gut microflora to bloom, so on and so forth. So we got to be careful about that correlation versus causation. And I will say that they can actually assess how much energy is lost in people now. It's usually around 5 to 10%, depending on people, and most of the 95% of their Gaussian distribution falls in there. It is a significant difference, but what I would say people is cautious about saying, well, this is why we see huge differences between individuals. Maybe for certain individuals, but I think for the vast majority of people, unless you're literally an outlier, probably going to be somewhere relatively close. So I think establishing that we understand that there is some variability in how much energy you can extract. And I'm going to come back to that as well, because it's another aspect of tracking push. But they confuse people. Now let's talk about the energy outside, because this is way more complicated. So different ways people have broken it down. But essentially, you have your BMR, which is your basal metabolic rate, and that's usually about 50 to 70% of the energy people expend per day. The way I tell it is basically the cost.
10 seconds.
And we would determine that if you were putting somebody in a metabolic chamber, I believe that we don't require them to be sleeping, but it's laying there and being
last
correct. And that's slightly different from your energy expenditure while sleeping.
Yeah, you have RMR and you have BMR, and there are some little differences between the two, but I mean, essentially it's very similar. I've had my RMR assessed, which is basically you go into a lab, you lay down, they make sure you're stable for 20 minutes, you don't talk, you don't listen to music, you don't do anything. Lay there and breathe. RMR and BMR are going to be very similar. I'm going to simplify it for our audience. It's already a complicated subject. The other way to think about it is if you were like a coma setting, where you're awake, having some brain activity, that sort of thing, you're not moving, you're not physically moving. That's still about 50 to 70% of people's total daily energy. And that's what we refer to as metabolic rate.
And when you had yours measured, Lane, did you have it done using indirect calorie?
Yes. And I had it done on anywhere between 1,900 and 1,950 calories.
Tell folks how that works, because I think when most people say, I just had my BMR measured, it's usually not the rigorous way that we're talking about using indirect calorimetry. It's usually relying on the heart rate and respiratory rate, which can probably give some approximation, but it's probably important for people to understand that there's an enormous error that's introduced when you make that approximation. So what's the rigorous way?
So direct telemetry is most and that is literally kind of a bomb telemetry. Right, you're in a metabolic chamber, and they are looking at how much heat you're generating, essentially. And from that heat that you generate, they're able to determine your total daily energy expenditure, and then using an equation based on your oxygen consumption and your CO2 production, they can determine what from that is your BMR, which is actually the same way they do indirect telemetry. You're inside this like hood, you're breathing into a tube essentially. Basically, your metabolic rate is very closely associated with how much oxygen you consume. How much oxygen you consume, how much CO2 you expire, will one give you a really good idea of your metabolic rate, because the end products of metabolism are CO2 and water. So when everything goes through this process of breaking down carbohydrates and fat, if you talk about like what happens to body fat, it ends up as CO2 and water. So if they know that, you can use a constant for water. If they know that, it's also why they can use double level water to estimate energy expenditure. We'll get to that later. But if you know that, you know these constants, you make several assumptions. And again, this isn't direct. You're making assumptions. You're making assumptions about how much is being generated. You can come up with a relatively accurate estimation of your metabolic.
And for reasons that I can't explain, this is something I can never forget, which is the coefficients for that equation. The Weir coefficients, right? So energy expenditure is 3.94 times VO2 plus 1.11 times VCO2. So, as you said, it's heavily weighted to oxygen consumption. 4 times the consumption of oxygen plus about 1 times the production of carbon dioxide. And that gives you that. And for anybody listening to this who's ever had a VO2 max test, I would encourage you to ask the lab that does it for you to give you the raw data. Because what they'll spit out for you, usually in 15-second intervals, is VO2, VCO2. And while the purpose of that test might be to determine your maximal VO2, you can also plug in these two variables to the Weir equation and get how many calories per minute you're consuming or requiring to maintain that energy output all the way to your max. It's actually quite remarkable when you consider that a highly trained individual will easily get to 20 calories per minute of energy demand.
If you think about, let's say, lean mass is by far the biggest correlate to the energy expenditure in all of it. Lean mass is quite a bit of oxygen compared to what adipose relatively low mass. It makes a lot of sense that you would see that. And then if you think about activity, obviously activity is part of it. So we have our BMR, which is about, in terms of the energy output. I guess I should define it. Energy output is what we're doing. All the energy you expend in a day. That's your TDEE. And the biggest portion of that is your BMR. For most people, not for at least anything you train about 6 to 8 hours a day, you can get to the point where your physical activity is actually greater than your BMR. Those listening, don't be dogmatic about it. For most people, 50 to 70%, it's relatively high. For me, it's probably about 55 because I do train like 2.5 hours
10
a day.
seconds.
So we have that. Then we have what's called TPF, which is thermic effective diet.
Rest.
And this is anywhere from 5 to 10% of your total daily energy expenditure for most people. Very, very hard to measure. Usually it's expressed in terms of calories per minute because they're only looking at it in the short term. And when we do studies of total daily energy expenditure, I mean, usually what they're doing is using a constant for TDF. They're making an assumption because it's just so hard to measure unless you're just measuring that over like a couple of hours or maybe a day. But we feel relatively confident based on the studies out there that it's about 5 to 10%. Not a big contributor, but still.
But it also seems to be macronutrient dependent, correct?
It is. It is.
We'll come back to that when we get to the
Yeah, yeah. And then if we look at the last component,
10
we
seconds.
have our physical activity. And this encompasses all physical activity. People hear this and they think exercise. But actually, for a lot of people, their biggest component
Let's go.
of physical
Last
activity
round.
is actually what's called NEAT, which is non-exercise activity energy. That is something that's actually extremely modifiable. We see it in terms of people who are obese resistant, when we term obese resistant, they tend to fidget a lot. They tend to move a lot. I was like this as a kid, I still am. Whereas people who are obese prone tend to have very low NEAT. In fact, there was a study done by Liebel in 1995 where they overfed people by, I want to say, 1,000 calories a day. They looked at their total energy expenditure, they're all very accurate. And then they took that number and added 1,000 calories. And they looked at how much weight people gained. Some people gained more than they expected. One person did not even have significant weight gain. What they found was this individual's NEAT, their spontaneous physical activity, went up so much it just compensated for that extra calorie. So I think this is what people really don't understand as well. I want to be very purposeful about how we define it because when it comes to NEAT versus exercise is purposeful. So something I'll hear a lot. Well, I'm going to go do a walk and get my NEAT up. No, you're doing exercise. Maybe I'm being a little bit pedantic, but it's important because NEAT is what I'm talking about. I'm waving my hands around. I'm moving from one foot to the next. I've seen people that like you kind of move your fingers and you twitch your neck. All that stuff, even though it seems like nothing, thousands of those movements over the course of the day actually add up. So then I have people say, well, I'm just going to tap the foot to get NEAT up or fidget. Well, guess what's going to happen? Whenever you try to do something that also requires your brain, you're going to stop doing that because you actually can't really do two things at once.
10 seconds.
So this truly is spontaneous energy. It appears to be modifiable by about 500 to 600 calories a day.
Rest.
And we do see this with overfeeding and underfeeding. And we'll get into talking about metabolic adaptation and how this is. But people who lose like 10% of their body weight, they've seen up to a 500 calorie reduction in NEAT. So that's a big portion of it. And then obviously we have the purpose. If we look at energy in, metabolizable energy, energy out, BMR, TEF, NEAT, and exercise. I'm simplifying this equation a little bit, but that's essentially it. If people want to invalidate energy balance, what I always say is, listen, you ate those carbons. Something must happen to them. They don't flutter off into oblivion, and you don't create them out of nothing. Something has to happen. And we have a lot of metabolic tracer studies to pretty much know what happens. I think the confusion becomes, well, I tracked my calories.
10
I ate
seconds.
in a 500 calorie deficit. I didn't. First off, if we look at where these mistakes come in, people weigh themselves around.
Let's go.
If you only weigh yourself once a week, I would say it's virtually meaningless. When we are trying to get data on people, we're very regimented with how we do. So it's you weigh in first thing in the morning after avoiding your bladder and bowel if possible, fasted. First thing you do, as soon as your feet hit the floor after you go to the bathroom, you weigh it. And then we take that weight every single day, and then we look at the average, and then we compare week-to-week averages. Because anybody who's ever tracked their weight, I'm sure you've had this experience. You're eating very consistently, you're tracking your weight, it'll easily fluctuate by 1 to 2%. So if you're 200 pounds, you could be 204, you could be 196. And I always tell people, it's like the stock market. Sometimes there's a good explanation for why it goes up and down, but other times there's no good explanation whatsoever. You don't just want to take like one isolated data. And this is also what people get that freak out. Because what's the pound of weed volume? You went and had it done at a different time.
Or on a different machine, different
Halfway
software.
I don't want to tell them not to get Nexus done, but unless you're going to do it, same tech, same machine, same conditions, I'm like, cool. Doesn't really mean anything, but you have it. So when you look at that, so you could have somebody, I've shown this example, where I've said your average weight is down by a pound. But if I had weighed you on this day last week and this day this week, you would think you were up by 2.5 pounds. So people will start doing a calorie deficit diet, and they'll say, well, see, I gained weight, so this doesn't. No, that is a fluid shift. Day-to-day changes in weight are much more dictated by fluid shift than adipose. But your weekly and monthly changes in weight are much more dictated by your body. That's one thing that confuses people.
10
the other
seconds.
thing I think that really confuses people is their idea that they can actually track their energy expenditure correctly using one of these. The wrist-worn devices, there was actually a study published in 2018 where they looked at about 20 different devices, found that they overestimate exercise energy expenditure anywhere from 28 to 93%. So you're doing this exercise that tells you burn 500 calories, when in reality you probably burn something like 260 to 400 calories. So again, people say, I burned 1,000 calories on the treadmill today. And I always tell people, what do you think is more likely? You have found a way to violate the laws of thermodynamics, or is it just watch my body? I'm going to go with the latter. It's very funny how people are very distrustful of certain things, and other things they're just like, oh yeah, I totally trust this thing. So there's that, and then there's also the fact that we can't completely accurately track calories in either, because there is up to a
10
20% error
seconds.
label allowed in food. I think that's where some of the confusion comes in. The other thing I will say that's worth saying, really upset
Let's go. Last
is
round.
people are horrible estimators of their energy. There was a study done back in the 90s where they took people who were self-reportedly resistant to weight loss. These are people who said, I eat 400 calories a day, I can't. They put them in a metabolic ward, and they also had them do double limited water, which is basically a free living way to limit energy. Plus, they had the direct limit. And they said to them, we want you to track your food and report it to us. But we will know if you're incorrect. We will know. So the average underreporting was by 50%. So they were underreporting their energy 50% on average. And that's right in line with a lot of the other stuff. If you look at people who are overweight and obese, most of them underreport by 30 to 70%. The demographic of obese women tend to be at the higher end of that. Obese men tend to be at the lower end of that. Even lean people.
Yeah, I was about to say, for lean people, would the same bias, I mean, bias might be the wrong word, would the same error in reporting still exist?
There is an error, it's less. I think it's around 18%. But even dietitians underreport by about 10%.
That's kind of amazing that they could be within 10%.
Yeah. Some of the subjects actually argued with the research about it. But people don't like that self-accountability sort of thing. Now, the message people will hear when they hear that, you're saying I'm a liar. And I don't think that people will necessarily lie. I think people are horrible estimators of their food intake. Because if I put a salad in front and I dump 50 grams of oil in versus 20 grams of oil, you have absolutely no idea of the difference. You might be able to taste like a little
10
bit
seconds.
feel. So most people go, it's a salad, got some dressing on it, probably 200, 300 calories. It's got nuts, it's got bacon, eggs, it's got oil, all that kind of stuff. I'm not saying any of those things are inherently bad. I'm just saying it's all energy. I think that's another big component. People are just horrible. What I'll tell people is if you really believe that you are not able to eat calorie deficit, I want you to just for 1 week track every single piece of food you put in. No licks, no bites, no snacks, I'm not saying you got to do this for the rest of your life, but just do this for 1 week. And usually I'll come back with people who are mind blown. They'll say, well, I thought I was eating 600 calories. I was eating 2,700. because they didn't realize that, like, they grab that handful of nuts, or they grab a handful of potato chips, or whatever it is, or they take a bite of a candy bar. Yeah, in isolation, none of that stuff is a big deal, but when you accumulate it throughout the course of the day, it can be.
8 years
10
ago,
seconds.
when I was really, really interested in this topic, I had the luxury of being able to spend probably about a total of 6 days in total inside a metabolic chamber in 2-day blocks.
Last round.
So 3 2-day blocks, or 4 2-day blocks inside
Probably
a
wasn't
metabolic chamber.
actually very much fun at the time.
Actually, it was the most fun thing I ever learned because it was everything I loved. First of all, I got to be in a room, nobody could bug me, and we had arranged it so that I could do all my exercises. So I had my bike on a fluid trainer, I had tons of weights in there, plyometric box, a bed. It was literally a vacation. And I had this amazing food being prepared by a metabolic kitchen. You've got this staff that is making to the gram everything that we had agreed at the outset we were going to be testing. And then after the fact, I went and did the 10-day double-weighted water experience, which I guess we could explain for people what that is. So water, everybody knows, is H2O, hydrogen 2, oxygen 1. But it turns out there's a heavy form of hydrogen called deuterium. And there's another form of oxygen that doesn't have 16, I'm so bad in my chemistry now, 16 protons, or is it neutrons? 16 neutrons. So instead they have 1 and 18 neutrons. And so you drink a D2 regular O and H2 heavy O. When you drink this, you basically get to exploit a trick, which is by collecting your urine, you're measuring the hydrogen that's coming out without measuring the carbon that's coming out. So you can impute what your VCO2 is effectively, and you collect urine serially over the course of 10 or 12 days. You get an estimate. And so the only instruction to me doing this was try to be weight stable for that period of time, which I was able to do. And it was interesting. That was a time in my life when I was really tracking ins and outs pretty well, mostly just out of curiosity, not because I was trying to lose weight or gain.
10 seconds.
And by my calculations, I was about 4,400 calories in, which would imply about 4,400 calories of energy expenditure. The DLW ended up being 4,200. So I was surprised it was pretty close because I agree, I expected it to be way far off. But it was such an amazing experience, and it's like, I almost wish stuff like that could be done commercially. Because, of course, I had to do this with an awesome guy named Eric Ravison at the Pennington Environmental Research Institute, and Eric's staff had done this for me. So it was, I was able to do this in a research lab. This would be an amazing thing that I wish you could order a home kit, drink this stuff down, run it out for 10 days, and truly get a sense of your energy.
What I would say is, since you're supposed to be weight stable, most people could actually do it just by default, because at the end of the day, if you're weight stable within reasonable amount, then whatever you're eating is actually, for all intents and purposes,
I'm just saying it's so hard for people, to your point, that is a hard thing for someone to do unless they're going to have a food scale with them everywhere. And they're, And then the other thing is it becomes a little bit of an artificial exercise, because even if somebody says, I'm willing to, for 10 days, measure everything,
last round,
then you get this sort of Hawthorne effect of they won't take that extra bite of the candy bar because A, they don't want to measure it, and they won't grab the handful of nuts and go through this other thing. Whereas if you say, look, I'm just going to eat the way I normally eat for a week and not measure anything, all I have to do is maintain my weight and do what you're saying. Right? Every morning you get on the scale and you kind of tweak it up and down. Then you can say, okay, in a truly free living environment without the Hawthorne effect, this is my energy intake.
So funny you say that. In science, we know that right down to individual particles, when you observe it, it changes its behavior. And that's true for just on the atomic level, and it's true for people. We have a coaching team called Team BioLane where we do one-on-one coaching. We have a team of 7 coaches. And one of the big things that we train our coaches on is like, hey, if somebody's like really resistant to something, just see if they'll just track what they're already doing. Enlighten them. We'll tell them, listen, we want the raw data. We don't
halfway there.
And almost every time, just by them doing that for a week, wow, I lost half a kilo or a kilo this week. And then, like you said, you didn't take that extra fiber.
We have that problem actually in our practice with our patients because for at least half the patients, once we do our intake, we realize nutrition is going to be an important thing to modify. And a lot of times we want to see what the baseline is. We go one step further, which is we do exactly that, which is we don't want to see you do anything different, but we really go out of our way to say, please do not change anything. In other words, eat that candy bar and grab that handful of nuts, pour that glass of wine a little taller than you think it should be. Like, do everything naturally, and even still, your point, it's almost impossible to improve baseline once you apply those constraints.
That just shows you how inaccurate.
Well done.
I think those are some of the biggest misunderstandings. Now, I do want to address the whole physicality